An old man breaks down a wall in his basement and uncovers something the past tried to hide. What was it? Watch till the end. Comment where you're watching from. Like and subscribe for more stories. The old house on Maple Street had stood through storms, blizzards, and decades of quiet summers. Inside it, Henry Miller moved slowly through the creaking hallway, one hand resting on the wooden banister as the afternoon light filtered through the curtains. He was 79, a man whose life had stretched across wars, marriages, and losses that still whispered through empty rooms. Since his wife Margaret passed away 2 years earlier, silence had become his closest companion. The grandfather clock in the living room ticked like a heartbeat, steady and unchanging, reminding him that time moved on whether he wanted it to or not. Henry's home was filled with memories that never quite left him. The smell of old pine floors, the faded wallpaper his wife had chosen, the dent in the kitchen table where his son Michael had carved his initials as a boy, all of it remained. Yet beneath that comfort, there was something that had always unsettled him. The bricked-up archway in the basement. It was unlike anything else in the house. An odd structure that his father had once told him to leave alone. The story was that the arch had been sealed decades before the Millers bought the property. No one in the neighborhood remembered why. Over the years, it had become part of the house's bones. Another mystery swallowed by time. Henry had thought about it often, especially at night when the wind hummed through the cracks in the window panes. He would imagine what might be behind that wall. An old coal chute perhaps, or some forgotten storage space. But something about the precision of the brickwork made him doubt that explanation. It wasn't a casual repair job. It looked deliberate, reinforced, as if someone had wanted to make sure no one ever opened it again. For decades, curiosity and caution had battled inside him. But grief had changed the balance. After Margaret's passing, he found himself drawn to that sealed doorway like a question that refused to fade. That spring afternoon, he stood at the top of the basement stairs, a flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Dust floated in the beam as he descended into the cool, damp air below. The basement smelled of earth and old iron. Shelves lined with paint cans and rusted tools stood against one wall. At the far end loomed the archway, its outline still visible beneath a crust of dust and cobwebs. Henry ran his palm along the cold brick surface and felt the uneven mortar beneath his fingertips. The thought came unbidden. He had lived in this house nearly 60 years, yet he had never truly known it. He fetched his old sledgehammer from the corner. It was heavy and worn smooth from years of use, its handle dark with age. He lifted it once, testing the weight, then swung gently against the wall. The clang echoed through the basement. The first few blows left little more than chips in the surface. Whoever built this wall had done so to last. Sweat began to bead on his forehead as he worked, each strike ringing through his arms. For an old man, it was exhausting labor. But there was something stubborn in him, something that had carried him through war and loss. He refused to stop. As the hours passed, he rested on the wooden steps, breathing heavily. The hole he had made was shallow, barely denting the surface. He laughed under his breath, half at himself, half at the absurdity of it. Still, the curiosity burned stronger now that he had begun. He realized he wouldn't be able to finish alone. He needed help. He climbed the stairs, wiped the dust from his hands, and stood by the kitchen phone for a long time before dialing the number he knew by heart. When Michael answered, there was a moment of silence before recognition softened his voice. They hadn't spoken much lately. Small disagreements had stretched into months of distance, but Henry didn't want to end their silence with more regret. "I could use a hand." "With something," he said simply. His son hesitated, then replied, "I'll be there in the morning." That night, Henry couldn't sleep. The wind pressed softly against the house, and the ticking of the clock seemed louder than usual. He sat in his armchair and looked at the photographs on the mantel. Margaret in her wedding dress, young Michael with a baseball glove, his own parents smiling in black and white. They were all frozen in moments that no longer existed. He thought about the wall again, about what it might mean to open it now at the end of his life. Maybe it wasn't just about curiosity. Maybe it was about closure breaking through something that had stood between him and peace. At dawn, he made coffee for two. The smell filled the kitchen as sunlight reached across the counter. He looked out the window and saw Michael's truck pulling into the driveway. When his son stepped inside, taller and broader than Henry remembered, there was an awkward stillness between them. But when Michael noticed the sledgehammer leaning against the wall, his face softened with a half-smile. "Still can't stay out of trouble, huh, Dad?" he said. Henry chuckled a dry, weary sound and handed him a mug of coffee. "Thought I'd finally see what's hiding down there." Together, they descended the basement stairs. The dust stirred again in the light, and the air seemed heavier than before. Michael ran his hand along the same bricks, frowning. "This isn't just a patch job," he said quietly. "Whoever sealed this wanted it sealed for good." Henry nodded, tightening his grip on the hammer. For the first time in years, father and son stood side by side, united by curiosity and something deeper. An unspoken need to understand not only the mystery inside the wall, but the distance that had grown between them. As Michael picked up the heavier demolition tools from his truck, Henry felt a faint spark of hope flicker through his chest. The work ahead would be hard. The wall might not want to give up its secrets easily, but for the first time in a long while, Henry didn't feel alone in the house. The day stretched out before them, heavy with promise and dust, as the sound of metal striking brick echoed through the quiet neighborhood of Providence. The past was stirring, and Henry Miller was ready to face whatever waited on the other side. The morning light filtered weakly through the basement windows as Henry and Michael stood before the bricked archway. Dust from the previous day still hung in the air, and the smell of damp stone clung to their clothes. Michael adjusted his gloves and looked at his father with a half-amused, half-concerned expression. "You really tried to do this alone?" he asked, eyeing the shallow dents Henry had managed to make. Henry shrugged, his face tired but defiant. "Didn't want to wait another 60 years. There was a quiet moment before Michael nodded and picked up the power drill he had brought from his truck. The sound filled the basement, deep, metallic, and relentless. Chunks of brick began to fall, scattering across the concrete floor. Henry watched, steadying the flashlight while his son worked, each strike revealing the wall's stubborn construction. Whoever had built it had meant for it to endure decades. Steel rods ran through the mortar, and layers of reinforced cement lay behind the outer bricks. It was overkill for a simple basement repair. As they worked, the rhythm of hammering and drilling filled the silence between them. For the first time in years, father and son shared a task without resentment or argument. There was something comforting in that, the unspoken language of labor, of sweat and persistence. Henry's mind wandered back to when Michael was a teenager, angry and restless, always wanting to leave home. He had joined the army young, and though Henry was proud, the distance between them had grown like a wall of its own. Now, with every strike against the bricks, it felt as though that barrier was slowly crumbling, too. Hours passed, and the room grew hot with their effort. They took breaks in silence, drinking water and breathing heavily, dust coating their hair and clothes. When they resumed, the wall finally began to weaken. Michael drove the chisel deep into one of the seams, and a hollow echo answered. He stopped, frowning. "Did you hear that?" he said. Henry nodded slowly, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The sound had come from behind the wall, an emptiness that didn't belong in solid ground. "There's a room back there," Michael said, his voice quieter now. "A big one." Henry's pulse quickened. The mystery that had haunted him for decades was about to yield. With renewed force, they kept going. The sound of falling bricks echoed through the basement until finally one side of the arch gave way with a crack that made them both step back. A thin cloud of dust burst into the air, and through it appeared a dark void. Henry felt his chest tighten as he peered inside. The beam of the flashlight reached only a few feet before being swallowed by darkness. "Careful," Michael warned. He pulled a small lantern from his tool bag and set it near the opening, its yellow light spilling faintly into the hidden space. What they saw made them both fall silent. The room beyond was larger than expected, stretching deeper under the foundation. Its air was heavy and stale, carrying the scent of age and rust. The floor was littered with debris, splintered wood, metal fragments, and something that looked like an old chair collapsed against the wall. Henry took a cautious step forward, his hand brushing the jagged edge of the broken bricks. The faint hum of memory filled his mind, as if the house itself was exhaling after decades of holding its breath. Michael followed, his boots crunching softly against the dust-covered floor. The beam of his lantern swept across the walls, revealing faint outlines of shelves and something that looked like papers plastered unevenly to the concrete. "This is no storage space," he murmured. Henry's throat felt dry. "Then what the hell is it?" he asked. The air was colder here, almost unnaturally so, and every sound echoed with an eerie clarity. They moved further in, the light revealing more details. Stacks of boxes sealed with old tape, a table overturned, and strange stains along the wall that time had turned black. After several minutes of exploring the perimeter, Michael found what looked like another layer of reinforcement at the far end. Thicker beams and heavy bolts. "Someone didn't just build this," he said. "They were hiding it." Henry felt a chill creep through his spine. There was something deliberate about every inch of the construction. It wasn't the work of ordinary homeowners. The sense of unease deepened with each discovery. They stood in silence for a long moment, absorbing the sight of the chamber. Then Michael spoke softly, almost to himself. "I wonder why they sealed it off." Henry didn't answer. His gaze drifted to the scattered papers on the ground, yellowed, brittle, with faded writing he couldn't quite read. He bent down, brushing the dust aside, and caught a glimpse of something odd. A small symbol drawn in thick black ink resembling a triangle within a circle. It looked official, but he couldn't place it. "Maybe we should stop here for today," Michael said. "This looks dangerous." Henry hesitated, still staring into the darkness ahead. "Just a little further," he said finally. His curiosity was stronger than his fear. They worked for another hour, clearing more debris, widening the entrance until it was large enough to step through. When they finally stopped, exhaustion had settled deep in their bones. The discovery was both thrilling and unnerving. As they stood side by side, covered in dust and sweat, the old man turned to his son and said quietly, "Tomorrow, we'll see what's really in there." When they climbed the stairs, the late afternoon sun had already turned the sky a dull orange. Henry looked back once before turning off the basement light. The dark gap in the wall seemed to watch them, silent and patient. Something about it felt alive, as if it had been waiting for this day all along. Upstairs, they shared a simple dinner, and though neither spoke of it directly, both knew their lives had already changed. That night, long after Michael had gone home, Henry sat alone at the kitchen table. His hands trembled as he sipped his coffee, eyes fixed on the basement door. The quiet seemed deeper now, as though the house itself was listening. He couldn't shake the feeling that what they had found wasn't just a forgotten room. It was the beginning of a story that had been buried for a reason, and tomorrow they would uncover the rest. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the sky sagging with clouds, as if the world above the Miller house shared the same unease stirring below. Michael arrived early, a thermos of coffee in one hand and a determined look in his eyes. Henry had barely slept. His mind had replayed the image of the dark opening again and again. Now, as they descended the basement stairs, the silence between them carried both anticipation and dread. The air was cooler today, sharper, as if it were seeping out from that hidden room. Dust motes swirled through the light as Michael turned on his lantern and handed the flashlight to his father. They stepped closer to the hole, now widened enough for a person to slip through. Henry hesitated for a moment at the threshold, feeling the pull of the unknown. Michael went first, ducking under the cracked archway, his boots crunching on the layer of debris that blanketed the ground. Henry followed, his heart pounding louder than his footsteps. Inside, the space opened wider than they had imagined. The ceiling arched low, supported by wooden beams that looked brittle with age. Along the right wall stood rows of crates, their surfaces coated in thick gray dust. Some were stamped with faded lettering numbers, codes, and military abbreviations Henry hadn't seen since his service days. The lantern's glow revealed more. A table against the far wall covered in brittle papers, rusted tools, and what looked like old diagrams. Henry approached carefully, brushing aside the cobwebs. The diagrams were hand-drawn, detailed sketches of mechanical parts and wiring systems. "These look like blueprints," Michael murmured, leaning in to study them. "But for what?" Henry didn't answer. His gaze drifted to the wall above the table, where something else caught his attention. Maps yellowed with age, pinned in a rough grid. He stepped closer and realized they weren't ordinary maps. They showed the city of Boston and its surroundings, marked with red circles and notations written in a hurried scrawl. Michael straightened, frowning. "Dad, this doesn't look right." Henry traced one of the circles with a trembling finger. It was centered around a federal building near the harbor. Another was drawn over a transportation hub. His throat tightened. "These aren't just maps," he said quietly. "They're plans." Michael's eyes darted to a pile of papers beside the maps. He picked one up carefully. It was a manifesto of sorts. Pages of typewritten statements filled with anger and political rhetoric from another era. The name at the bottom was unfamiliar, but the language was unmistakable. Calls to resistance, rebellion, and destruction. "What the hell is this?" Michael whispered. Henry's voice came out hoarse. "It's from the 60s. Groups like this popped up back then. Anti-government radicals. I remember hearing about them." He stared into the dim corners of the room where more boxes loomed like silent witnesses. "Looks like they never left." Michael crouched near one of the crates and pried it open. Inside were metallic components, wires, and glass containers labeled with chemical symbols. His stomach turned cold. "Dad," he said, his voice strained. "This isn't just paperwork. These are materials for making explosives." The words hung heavy in the air. Henry stepped back, gripping the flashlight tighter. The beam flickered across another crate, this one slightly ajar. Inside, cylindrical objects lay in neat rows wrapped in decaying cloth. He didn't need to be an expert to understand what they were. His knees weakened. "Don't touch anything," he said sharply. "Put the lid back." Michael obeyed, his expression tense. The reality of what they had uncovered settled like lead between them. The basement that had once been a harmless curiosity had become a crime scene, trapped in time. For a long while, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint creak of the beams overhead and the muffled drip of water somewhere in the dark. Finally, Henry said, "We need to call the police now." Michael nodded, already pulling out his phone, but as he did, the signal bars vanished. "No service down here," he muttered. They backed toward the opening, moving carefully, avoiding any sudden vibrations. When they emerged into the main basement, Michael finally made the call. His hands shook slightly as he spoke to the operator, explaining what they had found. The dispatcher's calm voice turned urgent, instructing them to leave the house immediately and wait outside for authorities. As they stepped out into the cool afternoon air, Henry felt the weight of 60 years pressing down on him. His home, his refuge, had been built over a secret he could never have imagined. He sat heavily on the porch steps while Michael paced the driveway. The sirens came faintly at first, then grew louder, echoing through the quiet neighborhood. Within minutes, police cars and emergency vehicles filled the street. Agents in dark jackets moved quickly, securing the perimeter and taping off the entrance. One of them approached Henry and Michael, asking them to describe everything they had seen. Henry told them about the crates, the maps, the blueprints. When he mentioned the explosives, the agent's expression darkened. "You did the right thing calling us," she said. "If those materials are still active, this could have been catastrophic." As technicians descended into the basement, Henry and his son stood together in uneasy silence. Through the open door, faint voices and the hum of equipment drifted up. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the yard. Henry's hands trembled slightly as he clutched the railing. "All these years," he murmured. "It was right beneath us." Michael looked at him, his face pale but resolute. "You couldn't have known," he said softly. Henry shook his head. "Maybe not, but the house did. It's been keeping a secret longer than I've been alive." As night fell, the neighborhood was evacuated for safety. Red and blue lights flashed against the darkened windows while teams of specialists worked below. The air was thick with tension, but also with something else, a strange, unspoken relief. The hidden room had been found. Whatever nightmare had been buried there would soon be gone. Henry watched the scene unfold, exhaustion settling over him. When an agent approached and gently placed a hand on his shoulder, he looked up, eyes tired but clear. "We'll take care of it, Mr. Miller," she said. "You did the right thing." Henry nodded slowly. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt old. And suddenly, very aware of how fragile the world beneath his feet could be. As the last of the crews entered the basement, Henry turned to Michael. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "this house will never be the same." Michael slipped an arm around his father's shoulders. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." Henry looked back at the doorway, the flicker of flashlights dancing beyond it, and for the first time that night, allowed himself to believe his son might be right. The past had finally been uncovered, and though it brought fear, it also brought something long overdue truth. The street outside the Miller home was no longer quiet. Floodlights cut through the evening darkness, painting the small house in harsh white. Police tape flapped in the breeze, and a row of black SUVs lined the curb. The once calm neighborhood had turned into a scene from a disaster movie with agents in protective gear moving briskly in and out of the basement. Henry stood behind the cordon, wrapped in a blanket an officer had given him, watching as strangers dismantled his world. Piece by piece, Michael was beside him, answering questions from a woman who introduced herself as Special Agent Sarah Donovan from the FBI's Boston field office. Her tone was calm but sharp, the kind of voice used to command in emergencies. She asked about the wall, when it had been sealed, how long they had lived there, who the previous owners were. Henry answered what he could, though most of it was guesswork. The truth was, no one had touched that part of the basement for over 60 years. As the investigation deepened, the news spread quickly. Reporters gathered at the end of the block, their camera lights flickering in the distance. The agents tried to keep them back, but the word explosives carried fast. Henry watched it all with a kind of detached disbelief. His home, his quiet sanctuary, was now a crime scene crawling with people in hazmat suits. He couldn't bring himself to leave. The air smelled of diesel and rain, and each time someone came up from the basement, he felt a strange pull in his chest. He wanted to know what they were finding. When Agent Donovan finally returned, her face was set in a grim line. "Mr. Miller," she said, crouching beside him. "What you discovered down there was part of an unfinished domestic terror plot. The materials and documents date back to the late 1960s. It appears the people behind it never carried out their plan." Henry's voice was quiet, but steady. "A plan to do what?" Donovan sighed, glancing toward the flashing lights to bomb a federal building in Boston. "They called themselves the Patriots of Justice. They vanished before they could act, but their base, your basement, was sealed and forgotten." Her words hung heavy in the air. Michael stared at the ground, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. "So, my dad's been living over a bomb for 60 years, he muttered. Donovan gave a small nod. "An unstable one. Some of the chemicals are still active. That's why we've evacuated the block." She stood, straightening her jacket. "We've called an ordnance specialist from D.C. They'll neutralize what's left and transport it to a secure facility. It's going to take all night." Hours passed slowly. The hum of generators filled the air as teams in protective suits worked methodically underground. Occasionally, a muffled shout echoed from below, followed by tense silence. Henry and Michael were escorted to a nearby command tent where agents offered them coffee and kept them updated in fragments. Henry barely touched his cup. Every so often, he caught himself glancing toward the house, half expecting to see smoke or fire. He didn't feel fear anymore, only a deep sorrow, a hollow ache that came from realizing his home had hidden something meant to destroy others. Near midnight, Agent Donovan returned with an update. "They've removed the most volatile materials," she said. "There was a near incident when one of the containers ruptured, but they stabilized it. We believe the rest can be safely extracted by morning." Michael exhaled sharply, his tension easing slightly. Henry nodded, though his eyes stayed distant. "How could something like this stay hidden for so long?" he asked. Donovan hesitated before answering. "The original investigation into the group ended abruptly. We found evidence they planned to flee after the plot failed. It's likely one of them sealed the place before leaving. Then the house changed owners. Records got lost, and the trail went cold. Until now." Outside, the night deepened. Rain began to fall lightly, glinting in the harsh lights as if the sky itself were trying to wash the memory away. The neighborhood remained quiet except for the hum of machinery. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, the final team emerged from the basement carrying sealed containers. One of them turned to Donovan and gave a brief nod. "All clear." Relief spread subtly through the group. Henry watched as the trucks departed, carrying away the last remnants of the hidden danger. The silence that followed was immense. For the first time since that wall came down, the house seemed at peace. When the agents began packing up their equipment, Donovan approached Henry and Michael once more. "We'll have structural engineers inspect your foundation in the morning," she said gently. "You'll be able to return once it's safe. I know this must be difficult." Henry's voice trembled slightly as he replied. "That house, it's all I have left. My wife, my memories, everything's in there." Donovan nodded, her expression softening. "I understand. But you should know, Mr. Miller. You likely prevented something far worse tonight. Those materials were still alive. If they'd been disturbed the wrong way, this whole block could have gone up. Henry said nothing for a long moment, then managed a faint, weary smile. Guess it's a good thing I'm slower than I used to be. As dawn approached, the street emptied, the flashing lights faded, and the agents drove away. The house stood alone again, marked by caution tape and the scars of a long night. Henry and Michael sat together in the car parked across the street, watching the first rays of light break through the clouds. You think it's really over? Michael asked quietly. Henry looked at his home, its windows dark and silent. No, he said softly. But maybe it's the beginning of something better. Michael glanced at his father, seeing in his tired eyes not fear, but a strange calm. They stayed there in silence until the sun rose fully, painting the world gold and new. For the first time in years, the distance between them felt smaller. The ghosts of the past had been dragged into the light. And though it left scars, it also gave them something neither expected: another chance. When Henry and Michael returned the next morning, the neighborhood had gone eerily still. The caution tape still fluttered weakly across the porch, and the once busy street was empty, except for a single police cruiser parked nearby. Dew clung to the grass, and the air carried the faint smell of wet earth and dust. The agents were gone. Only silence remained, deep and unfamiliar. Henry paused by the gate, his eyes resting on the house that had been his whole life. It looked smaller somehow, stripped of its secrets. Michael unlocked the door, and the hinges groaned softly as it swung open. Inside, the air felt cleaner, lighter, though the faint scent of metal still lingered. The basement door stood ajar. Henry stopped at the top of the stairs, staring into the dimness below. The wall was gone now, the chamber sealed off and cleared. Only a scar of exposed brick remained like a wound slowly healing. Michael joined him, resting a hand on the railing. They patched it up, he said quietly. Henry nodded, his throat tightening. It's strange, he murmured. For 60 years, that wall kept a secret buried. Now it's just another part of the house. He descended a few steps, his hand brushing along the cool surface of the new cement. It was smooth and solid, yet it felt different from before, clean, unburdened. When he reached the bottom, he stopped and took in the empty space. The hum of the refrigerator upstairs echoed faintly through the floorboards. The basement had always been cold, but now it felt almost peaceful, as though the house itself had finally exhaled. Michael's footsteps followed. He stood beside his father, glancing around at the cleared space. You think you'll stay here? He asked. Henry gave a faint smile. I've spent most of my life fixing things in this place. Maybe it's time to just live in it. He turned toward his son, studying the tired lines on his face, the gray that had begun to touch his temples. You know, he said softly, your mother always wanted us to get along. She'd be glad we finally did something together. Michael looked down, his voice low. It shouldn't have taken something like this to bring us here. Henry reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. Maybe, but sometimes it takes breaking something open to see what's really inside. For a moment, they stood there in silence, surrounded by the ghosts of what had been hidden. Later, they went outside and sat on the porch steps, the morning sun climbing higher. Over the rooftops, the birds were beginning to return, their songs faint but steady. Across the street, neighbors peeked through curtains, curious but cautious, whispering about what had happened. Henry didn't mind. Let them talk. The truth was no longer locked behind a wall. It had been faced, named, and carried away. He felt lighter than he had in years. A police officer approached to inform them that the investigation was closed and that the materials were safely destroyed. When he left, Henry watched his car disappear down the road, feeling as though something final had passed with it. By afternoon, the house seemed almost new. Sunlight fell across the living room floor, painting golden shapes on the old rug. Henry brewed 2 cups of coffee, just as he used to for Margaret. When he handed one to Michael, the simple act felt like peace. They sat quietly sipping and listening to the wind stir through the open window. There were no words that could fit what they had experienced, and none were needed. The silence was no longer heavy. It was healing. That evening, after Michael left, Henry walked through the rooms alone. Each step echoed softly, familiar and comforting. He paused by the mantel where the family photograph stood. Margaret smiling in the garden. Young Michael holding a fishing rod. His own younger self in a military uniform. All moments frozen in a time that felt both near and impossibly distant. He picked up the picture of Margaret and held it for a long moment. "It's over," he whispered. "We're safe now." The setting sun bathed the house in warm light, and for the first time in years, Henry felt a quiet contentment settle in his chest. He ended his day on the back porch, watching the horizon fade into shades of amber and violet. The cicadas had begun their slow chorus, and the air carried the scent of rain-soaked wood. He thought about how fragile everything was: walls, lives, even time itself, and how sometimes the things we build to keep danger out can also keep the truth trapped inside. He had spent his life afraid to open that wall, but by doing so, he had uncovered more than a secret. He had uncovered a part of himself that had been sealed away, too. As twilight deepened, Henry leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. The house stood quiet behind him, no longer haunted, no longer hiding. The night air was cool, and a sense of peace washed over him, a peace that came not from forgetting, but from finally understanding. The world had changed, yet it felt somehow right again. In the soft darkness of the Providence evening, the old man smiled faintly to himself. The past was gone, but life, fragile and steady, was still his to live. And as the stars began to appear above the rooftops, Henry Miller whispered a final thank you to the house, to time, and to the truth that had finally set him free. Sometimes the past is closer than we think. What would you have done in his place? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what you think about this story. If you liked the video, leave a like, subscribe, and share it with others. There's much more to come.